The phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember that detail because I was standing in the kitchen of my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating cereal straight from the box, the off-brand kind from the dollar section, because I was between paychecks and too proud to tell anyone. The milk had gone bad 2 days earlier. So there I was, 29 years old. Dry cereal. A lease I could barely make, and a phone ringing from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer it. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Sandra Pellegrino. She said she was a senior caseworker with the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. She said she had been looking for me for a while, and then she said, and I remember this word for word because I wrote it down the second the call ended, she said. Lauren, we need to talk about some financial activity that took place in your name when you were a minor, specifically between the years 2001 and 2009. I put the cereal box down on the counter. I did not say anything for a long moment because the name she used, Lauren, was a name I had not been called in 11 years. It was the name the Whitfield family used. The family that fostered me from the age of 7 until I aged out of the system at 18. The family I had spent the better part of a decade trying to forget. $420,000. That is the number Sandra eventually told me. That is the number attached to my name, my social security number, my childhood. Moved through accounts I never knew existed. Signed off by people I called mom and dad. And the worst part? I had no idea. Not even a hint. Not a single moment where something felt wrong enough to make me ask. That is the part that still keeps me up at night. Not the money. The not knowing. To understand what happened, you have to understand who I was at 7 years old when I was placed with the Whitfields. My birth mother's name was Renee. She was 24 when she had me. She was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was a person who was fighting a war inside herself and losing. Slowly, and I happened to be standing too close to the battlefield. By the time I was 6, she had been in and out of treatment twice. By the time I was 7, the state had decided I needed a more stable environment. That word, stable. I heard it so many times growing up that it stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like a threat. The first 2 placements did not work out. The details are not important right now. What matters is that by the spring of 2001, I ended up in a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane in Dayton, Ohio, with Douglas and Patricia Whitfield, and their biological son Marcus, who was 9 at the time. And for the first few months, honestly, it felt like something close to a miracle. Patricia made pancakes on Saturday mornings. Real ones, with blueberries. Douglas coached Marcus's Little League team, and he used to take me along to the games and let me keep score in a little green notebook. They had a golden retriever named Biscuit, who slept at the foot of my bed. I had my own room with a window seat. There was a library card with my name on it. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I am setting up a fall. And I am. But I need you to understand that the fall was so devastating precisely because the before was so real. Those pancakes were real. That notebook was real. I was a 7-year-old kid who had spent the previous year eating crackers for dinner and sleeping on a pull-out sofa. The Whitfields gave me something I had never had. They gave me the feeling that I was worth taking care of. I should have been more careful with that feeling. I know that now. When you are a child who has been hungry, not just for food, but for consistency, for safety, for someone to just look at you and stay, you will do almost anything to keep the people who finally showed up. You will make yourself smaller. You will not ask questions. You will convince yourself that everything is fine. Because the alternative is that nothing is fine, and you cannot survive that again. That is the flaw I carried into that house. Not stupidity. Not weakness. Desperation. The quiet, bone-deep desperation of a kid who needed this to work. By the time I was 10, I had been in the Whitfield home for 3 years. The official plan was reunification with my mother, but that process kept stalling. Renee would stabilize, then slip. Stabilize, then slip. And each time the timeline shifted, I would go back to my room on Sycamore Lane and sit on that window seat and watch Biscuit chase squirrels in the backyard and think, maybe this is where I belong. Douglas worked in commercial real estate. Patricia was a dental hygienist who had cut her hours down to part-time after I arrived. They were not wealthy people, not obviously, but they were comfortable. They owned their home. They took vacations to Myrtle Beach. Marcus had a gaming console and new sneakers every school year. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that my presence in that house had opened a financial pipeline they were actively draining. Here is how foster care works in Ohio and in most states. When you take in a foster child, the state provides a monthly stipend to cover the cost of care: food, clothing, housing, medical needs. The amount varies based on the child's age and any special needs designation. For a standard placement in the early 2000s in Ohio, you were looking at somewhere between $400 and $800 a month. That is the legal part. That is the part everyone knows about. What I did not know about were the other accounts, the other designations, the other paperwork, because it turns out there were things about my file, my history, my mother's history, that qualified me for benefits I never knew existed, and someone in that house had done their homework. And look, before I go any further, if you have ever been in a situation where you trusted someone completely and found out later that the whole thing was a transaction to them, you already know exactly what I am about to describe. If that hits close to home, you might want to stay for this, because this story goes places I did not see coming, and I was the one living it. Here is what Sandra Pellegrino walked me through on that phone call, and in the 3 meetings that followed over the next 2 months. When I was placed with the Whitfields, my file contained information that Douglas, specifically, had taken the time to examine very carefully. He was not just a foster parent making a charitable choice. He was, and I say this with the full weight of what the investigation later confirmed, a man who understood systems, who understood loopholes, who understood that a child with a complicated history and no advocate checking the details is an opportunity. I know how cold that sounds. I know it, but I need you to sit with it, because understanding the coldness is the only way to understand the scale of what happened. My mother, Renee, had received a structured settlement from a car accident when she was 19, before I was born. The settlement was modest, around $40,000, but it had been set up in a way that designated a portion to any minor dependents in the event of her incapacitation or loss of custody. When Renee lost custody of me, that designation triggered. A trust was opened in my name. The amount was not enormous, somewhere around $18,000, but it was a start. Douglas found out about it. I do not know how. The investigation suggested he had a contact inside the casework system, someone who had given him access to more information than he should have had about incoming placements. That part was never fully proven. But what was proven was that within 6 months of my arrival, Douglas had positioned himself as my financial guardian for the purposes of managing that trust. And once that door was open, he walked through every other door he could find. Over the next 8 years, the Whitfields, primarily Douglas, with Patricia's knowledge and participation, drew from or redirected the following: the original $18,000 trust, a survivor's benefit connected to my maternal grandfather's Social Security that none of us knew existed, 3 separate state and federal grants tied to my specific placement category as a child with an unstable home history, a medical reimbursement fund that was supposed to cover therapy and counseling costs, and, the one that took the longest to unravel, a fraudulent claim filed under my Social Security number that was not discovered until after I had turned 18, and the system stopped actively monitoring my case. $420,000. Moved. Redirected. Spent. Over 8 years. While I sat at their kitchen table, doing homework. While I slept in the room with the window seat. While I thanked Patricia for the pancakes and told Douglas that I was grateful to be there. The cruelest part of a long con is not the moment you discover it. The cruelest part is the retroactive contamination. Every memory gets touched. Every kindness gets a question mark attached to it. Were the pancakes real? Was the little green notebook for scorekeeping? Was that warmth? Or was that management? Was Douglas keeping me compliant? Was Patricia's warmth a strategy? or just the compartmentalization of a woman who had convinced herself that taking care of me in daily life somehow canceled out what her husband was doing on paper. I do not have clean answers to those questions. I am not sure I ever will. What I do know is this. By the time I turned 14, something in the texture of that house had shifted. Subtly, the way weather shifts before a storm. Not dramatically, just a drop in pressure that you feel in your chest before you can name it. It started small, the way these things always do. I was 14, and I had been accepted into a summer arts program at the local community center. It was a drawing and illustration course, nothing elaborate. $65 for 6 weeks. I had seen the flyer at school and circled it in red pen and left it on the kitchen counter in a way that I thought was subtle, but was probably not subtle at all. Patricia saw it. She said she would look into it. A week went by. I mentioned it again. She said Douglas was handling the finances right now, and things were a little complicated. I nodded and did not push, because that is what I did. I did not push. 2 weeks after the registration deadline, I found out Marcus had signed up for a private soccer clinic that cost $400. I sat with that information for a long time, in my room, with the window seat. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, that Marcus's clinic had been planned months earlier, that $65 and $400 are different numbers and maybe they only had room for one right now. I told myself a lot of things, but I also felt something I had never let myself feel in that house before. Expendable. The feeling passed. Or I pushed it down far enough that it stopped surfacing. That is a skill you develop when your survival depends on maintaining a particular story about your life. You get very good at overwriting the moments that do not fit. By 16, I was working a part-time job at a grocery store on weekends. Douglas had told me, gently, reasonably, that it would be good for me to learn the value of earning my own money. That self-sufficiency was important, that he and Patricia were happy to cover the essentials, but that some independence would serve me well in the long run. I believed him. I worked hard. I saved my checks in a jar in my closet. What I did not know was that at the same moment Douglas was encouraging my self-sufficiency, he was signing documents on my behalf that redirected a federal educational savings benefit, money specifically designated to support my post-secondary education, into a private account he controlled. He was teaching me about the value of hard work while cashing checks with my name on them. I need to pause here because I know what some of you might be thinking. Why did no one in the system catch this? Where were the caseworkers? Where were the annual reviews? And the honest, frustrating answer is, they were there. There were reviews. There were annual check-ins. There were forms signed and boxes checked. And Douglas Whitfield was very good at presenting a particular picture. He was organized. He was articulate. He spoke the language of systems the way someone speaks a second language they have spent years perfecting. He knew what they were looking for, and he gave it to them. He was not a monster who looked like a monster. He was a man who looked like a good foster father, because in the ways that were visible, he was performing that role competently. I was clothed, fed, enrolled in school, receiving passing grades, not presenting behavioral problems. The money was happening somewhere the caseworkers were not looking. I turned 18 in November of 2009. In Ohio, aging out of foster care means the state's legal responsibility for you officially ends. The stipends stop. The oversight stops. You are, on paper, an adult. You are expected to stand up and walk forward into your life on your own 2 feet, regardless of whether anyone has given you the tools to do that. The Whitfields threw me a small birthday dinner. Patricia made my favorite meal. Baked chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. Douglas gave a short speech about how proud they were of the young woman I had become. Marcus gave me a card. There was a small chocolate cake with 18 candles. 3 weeks later, I moved into a one-room apartment on the east side of Dayton with 2 garbage bags of belongings and $1,100 in savings from 2 years of grocery store work. The Whitfields helped me carry the bags up the stairs. Patricia hugged me at the door and told me to call if I needed anything. Douglas shook my hand. And that was it. I stood in that empty apartment for a long time after they drove away. The walls were that particular shade of off-white that says no one has ever cared about this room. There was a smell, old cooking grease and something faintly chemical. The refrigerator hummed too loud. I sat down on the floor, because there was no furniture yet, and I ate the leftover piece of birthday cake that Patricia had wrapped in foil and put in my bag. And I told myself, this is fine. This is forward. This is what growing up looks like. I did not think about money. I did not think about accounts, or trusts, or benefits. I did not think about any of that. I was 18 years old, and the only financial concept I had fully internalized was the number on my grocery store paycheck. The things I did not know about were, at that moment, still sitting quietly in accounts that Douglas controlled, still being managed, still being accessed. The audit would later show that he continued to draw from certain instruments for nearly a year after I aged out, exploiting the gap between my official emancipation and the point at which the state would have any reason to look closely at my file again. He had timed it. He had actually timed the final withdrawals. The 11 years between my 18th birthday and Sandra Pellegrino's phone call are their own story. I will give you the short version. I worked. I moved around. Columbus, then Cincinnati, then back to Columbus. I put myself through a 2-year accounting program at a community college. The irony of that is not lost on me, and got a job doing bookkeeping for a small landscaping company. I had relationships that did not last. I had friendships that did. I stayed in loose contact with a few people from the foster care system, including a woman named Deb, who had been in my original placement before the Whitfields, and who had also aged out with very little. I did not stay in contact with the Whitfields, not out of hostility, at least not consciously. More like when I left that apartment, I stepped into a version of myself that did not include them. The pancakes and the window seat and the little green notebook all got filed away in a part of my memory labeled things that helped but are over now. I was surviving. I was doing okay. Not great, but okay. And then the phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March. Dry cereal. A number I did not recognize. Sandra Pellegrino told me that the case had been opened as part of a broader state audit of foster care financial management. A review triggered, of all things, by a completely unrelated fraud case in another county that had prompted investigators to look more closely at long-closed files. Someone had noticed a pattern, flagged it, pulled my file. And what they found when they looked at 11 years of closed paperwork was a very tidy, very deliberate, very patient theft. Be honest with me for a second. If you were in my position, 29 years old, working a bookkeeping job, barely keeping up with rent, and someone called to tell you that $420,000 had been taken from you as a child, what would your first feeling be? Not what you think you should feel, what you would actually feel. I want to know. Drop it in the comments. Because my first feeling was not anger, and I think that surprised me more than anything else that came after. My first feeling was shame, which makes no logical sense. I know that. I was a child. I had no access to those accounts. I had no knowledge of what was being done. There is nothing in any reasonable framework of personal responsibility that should have pointed that feeling in my direction. And yet, the shame came first. Hot and fast and specific. The shame of having been in that house for 11 years and not seen it. The shame of having thanked them. Of having believed, genuinely believed that they were good people who wanted me there. The shame of having been, and this is the word that kept circling, useful. Not chosen. Not loved. Useful. I sat on my kitchen floor that Tuesday. I had moved from the counter to the floor at some point during Sandra's call. I do not remember when. And I looked at the wall and I thought, I was a revenue stream. For 11 years, I was someone's revenue stream. And I ate their pancakes and kept their score and called their dog by name, and I was grateful. The shame lasted about 4 hours. And then something else moved in. Something much quieter. Much colder. The feeling of a door opening in a part of yourself you did not know existed. A room you have never been in, where the air is very still and very clear. The feeling of, I am going to find out exactly what they did. And then I am going to make sure they cannot pretend it did not happen. That was the moment I stopped being the kid on the window seat. That was the moment the story changed. Sandra Pellegrino gave me a lot of information in that first phone call. But she also gave me a choice. She was careful about it, the way people who have delivered news like this before learn to be careful. She told me that the state had already opened an investigation, that my cooperation would help but was not legally required, that she understood if I needed time, that this kind of information is a lot to process and there was no rush. She said all the right things. She was kind about it. And when she finished talking, I asked her 2 questions. The first question was, how did nobody catch this for 11 years? The second question was, what do I need to do to make sure it does not just disappear into a filing cabinet? Sandra was quiet for a moment after the second one, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, that question tells me you are going to be okay. Most people only ask the first one. I did not feel okay, but I understood what she meant. Here is the thing about finding out you have been defrauded. There is a version of this story where you hand everything over to the appropriate authorities and trust the system to handle it, and you try to move on with your life. That is a legitimate choice. I am not criticizing anyone who makes it. Systems do sometimes work. Investigations do sometimes produce consequences. But I had spent 18 years inside a system that was supposed to be protecting me, while someone very methodically robbed me through it. The idea of handing everything back to that same system and walking away was not something I could make myself do. So I told Sandra I wanted to be involved, that I wanted access to the records, that I wanted to understand every line. She sent me the first packet of documents 10 days later. It arrived in a manila envelope, priority mail, at my apartment in Columbus. I remember picking it up from the mailbox on a Saturday morning. The envelope was heavier than I expected. Thick. Dense. With paper. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I opened it. And I started reading. Nobody tells you this about financial fraud investigations, but I will tell you now, they are extraordinarily boring to read. The records are dense. The language is technical. The numbers appear in columns that do not immediately announce themselves as criminal. They just sit there, flat and official, waiting for you to understand what you are looking at. It took me 3 full weekends to get through the first packet alone. I worked as a bookkeeper. I knew how to read financial documents. I knew how to follow a paper trail. And even with that background, there were moments where I would stare at a particular line item for a long time before the implication of it fully landed. Let me walk you through some of what I found. Not all of it. The full audit ran to over 400 pages. But enough that you understand how this worked. The original trust, the $18,000 from my mother's settlement, was the first account Douglas had accessed. He had been named as the managing trustee for the account when I was 8 years old, approximately 1 year after my placement. The documentation showed that he had filed the paperwork himself, citing the need for a responsible adult to manage funds on behalf of a minor in state care. The caseworker who signed off on it was a woman named Carol Brannigan, who had since retired. Her signature appeared on 3 separate documents that gave Douglas an expanded level of financial authority over my case. Carol Brannigan. I wrote that name down. The trust was drawn down over approximately 4 years, in increments small enough not to trigger standard audit flags, never more than $1,500 in a single month, always with documentation attached, receipts, invoices, written justifications, most of which, the investigation later confirmed, were fabricated. He had kept receipts, fake ones, organized in folders. That detail hit me differently than the others, because it spoke to planning, not impulse, not opportunism in the moment. Real, deliberate, sustained planning. He had created a paper architecture that was designed to survive exactly the kind of review that eventually found it. And it almost did survive. It took a completely unrelated fraud case in a different county to shake the right document loose. The survivor's benefit connected to my maternal grandfather was more complex. My grandfather, a man I had never met, who had died 2 years before I was born, had contributed to Social Security for decades before his death. His record showed surviving minor dependents as eligible beneficiaries. When my mother lost custody and I entered state care, a benefit was technically triggered that should have been tracked and allocated to my welfare. It was tracked. It was allocated. It was redirected to an account in Douglas Whitfield's name that listed me as the beneficiary. but that he had sole signature authority over. I sat with that one for a long time. My grandfather, a man I had never met, had paid into a system his whole working life. And somewhere in that system, his contribution was supposed to reach me. A small piece of protection from a man I would never know, passed down through bureaucracy and paperwork, landing in the hands of Douglas Whitfield. I do not have a clean way to describe what that felt like. There was grief in it that I was not prepared for. The grants were the part that made Sandra's team most concerned from a legal standpoint, because they involved federal money. There are programs, several of them, designed specifically to support children in foster care who meet certain criteria, children with documented histories of instability, children whose biological parents have substance use disorders, children who have experienced multiple placements. I qualified for several of these programs. The grants attached to those qualifications were substantial, in the range of $8,000 to $12,000 each, over multiple years. Douglas had applied for them, on my behalf, with documentation that accurately described my history, because my history was real, and the suffering behind those qualifications was real, and then received the funds into accounts that were supposed to be managed for my benefit. The therapy reimbursement fund was the one that made me the angriest. I had been in therapy from ages 9 to 13. A woman named Dr. Marion Chu at a practice on the west side of Dayton. I remember those sessions. I remember the beige couch and the small bowl of mints on the table, and the way Dr. Chu would wait, really wait, without filling the silence, for me to find the words for things I did not have words for yet. Those sessions were important. They helped me. The state had a reimbursement program for exactly that kind of therapeutic support for children in foster care. Douglas had submitted claims for reimbursement. He had received payments for services that Dr. Chu had in fact provided, but the investigation found that he had also submitted claims for sessions that never occurred. False dates, fabricated service codes, claims filed after Dr. Chu's office had already closed my file. He had billed the state for therapy I did not receive, and pocketed the difference. I sat very still in my kitchen when I read that page. The refrigerator hummed. There was traffic outside on the street. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary Saturday. And I thought about 9-year-old me on that beige couch, learning to find words for the hard things. And I thought about Douglas, at home, filling out forms. Sandra and I settled into a working rhythm over the following months. She would send me documents. I would go through them with the precision I had spent years developing at work, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies, building a chronological map of every transaction. Then I would send her back annotated versions with questions, and she would answer what she could and escalate the rest to the investigators on her team. I was not an official part of the investigation. I want to be clear about that. I had no legal authority, no formal role. What I had was access to my own records, a professional familiarity with financial documentation, and an absolute refusal to let any of this slide past me without being understood. I also had rage. Controlled, specific, useful rage. The kind that does not make you reckless. The kind that makes you sit down at a table on a Friday night instead of going out and read documents until midnight, because you have decided that you are going to know this file better than anyone. What I found, working through the records in my own order, were things that even the state investigators had not yet flagged. The most significant was a discrepancy in the educational savings account records, the account Douglas had redirected when I was 16, while encouraging me to save my grocery store paychecks. The state's audit had identified the account and the redirected funds. What they had not yet traced was a secondary transaction, a transfer made 6 months after I turned 18, nearly a year after the redirected funds had been moved. That secondary transfer moved money out of an account in Douglas's name, which already should not have existed the way it did, into an LLC, a real estate holding company registered in Ohio, a company I had never heard of, Whitfield Property Holdings. I ran that name through Ohio's Secretary of State Business Registry. It took me about 4 minutes. The company had been registered in 2007, 2 years before I aged out. The registered agent was Douglas Whitfield. The listed members were Douglas Whitfield and this is where I had to read the line 3 times. Patricia Ann Whitfield. Patricia knew. She had always known. She was not a passive bystander who had looked the other way. She was a named member in the corporate structure that had received money from my accounts. I called Sandra the next morning. I told her what I had found. There was a long silence on her end. And then she said, "Lauren, I need you to forward me exactly what you are looking at." Whitfield Property Holdings changed the shape of the case. Here is something nobody prepares you for when you are building a case against people you once loved. You start to grieve them while you are building it. Not the real them, the documented, provable, transactional them. You grieve the version of them you believed in. The Patricia who made blueberry pancakes. The Douglas who let me keep score in the green notebook. Even Marcus, who had nothing to do with any of it and probably did not know. And who I found myself worrying about in the middle of nights when the paperwork was spread across my kitchen table and I was trying to figure out what justice was supposed to look like. Because Marcus was real. That was real. And somehow holding both things, the real warmth and the documented fraud, without letting one cancel out the other, was the hardest cognitive work I have ever done. I did not let the grief slow me down. But I want to name it, because I think the narrative of revenge, and yes, this is a revenge story, I am not pretending it is not. The narrative of revenge often skips that part. It goes straight from discovery to action. Victim becomes warrior, ready and righteous. That is not how it actually works, at least not for me. I was grieving and strategic at the same time. Both things were true. Both things had to be. If you have ever had to hold two completely contradictory truths about the same person, someone who was genuinely good to you in some ways and genuinely terrible in others, you know how disorienting that is. It does not fit neatly into a story. It does not fit neatly into anything. If that resonates, I think you already know why I kept going. And if you are watching this and thinking about someone in your own life right now, I see you. Drop something in the comments. You do not have to explain the whole thing. By month 4 of my involvement in the review process, the state investigation had expanded. The original scope had been my files specifically, but as the investigators pulled on the threads I had helped identify, particularly the Whitfield Property Holdings connection, they started looking at other cases Douglas had been adjacent to. Other children. Other files. I want to be careful here, because the details of those other cases are not mine to tell, but I can tell you what Sandra told me, in general terms, in a phone call that I took sitting in my car in a parking garage during my lunch break, because I had needed to step away from my desk. I was not the only one. There had been 2 other children in the Whitfield home. Not at the same time as me, before me, in the late 1990s. Both had aged out. Both had files with similar patterns of financial management. Neither had ever filed a complaint. Possibly because neither had ever known there was anything to complain about. Sandra said the investigators were attempting to contact them. I thought about those 2 people. Adults now, somewhere in Ohio, living their lives. And I wondered if they were eating dry cereal and paying rent and thinking everything was just the way things are. The way I had been. For 11 years. The discovery of the other cases did something important to the investigation from a legal standpoint. It shifted the framing from isolated misconduct to a pattern of behavior. Prosecutors, Sandra explained carefully without making promises, tend to take a different view of a pattern than of a single incident. It also meant that the $420,000 attached to my name was likely not the full number. Douglas Whitfield had been doing this for a long time. Carefully. Patiently. Moving through the system the way someone moves through a house they have learned the layout of in the dark. Confident. Unhurried. Knowing exactly where each door is. There was a moment, around month 6, when I almost went to see them. I will be honest about this because I think it is important. I had Douglas's current address, not through any official channel, just through the kind of basic internet searching anyone can do. They were still in Dayton, still on Sycamore Lane actually, the same house. I had driven past it once, years earlier, by accident, or what I told myself was accident, and the golden retriever on the front lawn had been a different dog by then. But the same breed. Same yard. I had this image in my head of pulling up to that house. Walking to the front door. Knocking. Watching Douglas open it and seeing his face. when he realized who was standing there. I played the scene out in my mind enough times to know exactly why I could not do it. Not because I was afraid. Not because I did not want to see his face. Because the moment I showed up at that door, I became someone acting on emotion. And the second I acted on emotion, I handed him a tool. A performance he could use. A story he could tell about an unstable former foster child with a grudge that would distract from the $420,000 in documented transactions. The people who have taken something from you are always waiting for you to lose control, because your loss of control is the only thing that can save them. I did not go to Sycamore Lane. I went back to my kitchen table instead. I opened the next document. I kept reading. What I did do, around that same time, was contact a lawyer. Her name was Angela Reyes. She practiced civil litigation in Columbus, and she had been recommended to me by Deb, my friend from the foster care system, who had done her own version of aging out hard, and had, over the years, become something of an unofficial advocate for former foster youth. Deb knew people. Deb always knew people. Angela was direct in a way that I appreciated immediately. She told me that the criminal investigation was the state's case to prosecute, not mine. That my role there was witness and victim, but that there was a parallel civil action available to me, a lawsuit against Douglas and Patricia Whitfield individually, that I had standing to pursue regardless of how the criminal case resolved. She also told me something that I had not fully understood before that conversation. She told me that the statute of limitations for civil fraud claims, in Ohio, is extended in cases where the victim was a minor at the time the fraud occurred, and did not discover the fraud until adulthood. The clock, for my purposes, had started the day Sandra Pellegrino called me. I had time. The law had actually given me time. That felt significant in a way I could not fully articulate. Like the system that had failed me for years had accidentally left one door open. I told Angela I wanted to move forward. I do not know how they found out the investigation had expanded. I never learned that detail, but approximately 8 months after Sandra's first phone call to me, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer it. Again. The voice on the other end was Patricia Whitfield. She sounded older. Of course she did. It had been 11 years. But she also sounded careful. The way someone sounds when they have thought very precisely about what they are going to say before they dial. She said she wanted me to know that she had always cared about me, that the decisions made during those years had been complicated, and that Douglas had handled things she had not fully understood, that she hoped I knew that what she had given me, the home, the stability, the daily care, had been real. She did not say she was sorry. She did not use the word fraud. She did not mention the LLC. I let her finish. I said, "I appreciate you calling, Patricia," and I ended the call. Then I called Angela and told her Patricia Whitfield had just made unsolicited contact. Angela said, "Good. Do not call her back. Do not respond to anything else. And if she calls again, let it go to voicemail." I thought about that phone call for a long time afterward. About what Patricia had been hoping for. A conversation, maybe. An opening. A chance to reframe things. To position herself as the woman who had made pancakes and hosted birthday dinners, and not the woman whose name was on the LLC paperwork. She had raised me for 11 years. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to reach for. The pancakes. The stability. The daily care was real. She was not wrong that those things had happened. She was counting on me to weight them against everything else and find some kind of balance. I had spent months with the documents. I knew what the balance actually looked like. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, 11 months after Sandra's first call. Angela had prepared me thoroughly. We had done multiple practice sessions. She had walked me through every question the defense attorney might ask, every attempt to reframe my testimony, every technique for making a witness seem unreliable, emotional, or motivated by something other than the truth. She told me, "You know this material better than almost any victim I have ever worked with. That is your advantage. Do not let them make it into a liability by framing it as obsession." I understood what she meant. A woman who has spent 11 months reading financial documents about her own childhood can be made to look like she has constructed a narrative, rather than uncovered one. That was a risk I was aware of. The deposition took place in a conference room in downtown Columbus. Douglas and Patricia were both present with their attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had the particular quality of looking perpetually bored, which I later understood was a deliberate performance. I had not seen Douglas in 11 years. He was heavier. His hair was gray at the temples. He was wearing a blue button-down shirt, and he held a pen between his fingers the entire time, clicking the top of it in a rhythm that I recognized immediately. He used to do that at the kitchen table when he was working through something. Paying bills. Reviewing documents. I looked at him clicking that pen and I thought, I know every document in this case. I know the dates and the account numbers and the transfer amounts and the fabricated receipts and the LEL structure. I know it all, and you have no idea how well I know it. Patricia did not look at me once during the full 3 hours. Douglas looked at me twice, both times briefly. The second time, just for a moment, something moved across his face. Not guilt, I want to be honest about that. It was not guilt. It was something closer to assessment. The way someone looks when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. He had expected someone easier to dismiss, I think. I think he had built a version of me in his head, the lost foster kid, overwhelmed, probably not well-resourced, probably willing to be managed. And the person sitting across the table from him in that conference room did not match that version. Good. I answered every question clearly and completely. I cited specific documents by exhibit number. I corrected 2 mischaracterizations from Gerald Foss, without raising my voice, when he suggested that my understanding of the financial records might be influenced by my professional background in bookkeeping, implying bias. I said calmly that my professional background was precisely what allowed me to read the documents accurately, and that the documents spoke for themselves. Angela told me afterward that I had been the best prepared witness she had ever deposed. I went home that night and sat on my kitchen floor again. Different floor than 11 months earlier. I had moved to a slightly better apartment by then. But the same posture, same stillness. I ate a bowl of soup, real soup, from actual groceries. And I waited for what came next. Look, if you have made it this far, you already know this is not just a story about money. This is a story about what it costs to decide you are worth fighting for, even when the system that was supposed to protect you was the one that let the harm happen. If you know someone who is carrying something like this, quietly, alone, not sure if what happened to them even counts as something to fight, maybe send this to them. Because it counts. Whatever happened to them, it counts. The charges were filed on a Wednesday morning, in April. I found out the way most people find out about things now. Not from a phone call, not from a letter, but from a news alert that appeared on my phone screen while I was sitting at my desk at work. Local Dayton couple faces federal fraud charges related to foster care financial misconduct. I read the headline 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on my desk. Then I picked it up again and read the article. Douglas Harold Whitfield, age 57. Patricia Ann Whitfield, age 54. Charged with wire fraud, Social Security fraud, and misappropriation of federal funds allocated for the welfare of a minor. The article was careful. It cited sources close to the investigation, rather than naming anyone. But it mentioned that the case had been expanded to include financial misconduct across multiple foster placements spanning nearly 15 years. It mentioned that investigators had identified a pattern of systematic exploitation of state and federal benefit programs. It mentioned that the couple had owned a real estate LLC that had received funds investigators believed to be fraudulently obtained. It did not mention my name. I was grateful for that. I sat at my desk for a long moment after I finished reading. My coworker, a man named Phil who handled accounts receivable and minded his own business in the particular way that good coworkers do, looked over and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, just something I have been waiting on for a while." He nodded and went back to his spreadsheet. I thought I would feel something large, something with clean edges, triumph, or relief, or the particular satisfaction of a door finally closing. What I actually felt was something quieter and harder to name. Like the moment after a very long walk when you finally sit down and your legs start to understand that they have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight is not gone. It is just redistributed. The charges were real. The case was moving forward. And now came the part I had not fully prepared for. Waiting. Here is what I learned, through Angela and through the investigators, about how the Whitfields responded to the charges being filed. Gerald Foss, the perpetually bored defense attorney, entered a not guilty plea on behalf of both of them. That was expected. What was not expected, at least not by me, was the posture they adopted publicly in the weeks that followed. Douglas gave a brief statement through Foss's office. It described the charges as the result of a misunderstanding of complex financial arrangements that were always intended to benefit the children in their care. It used the phrase dedicated foster parents 4 times in 11 sentences. It characterized the investigation as the result of an overzealous audit triggered by an unrelated case, and suggested that the records, when properly contextualized, would demonstrate nothing more than administrative imprecision. Administrative imprecision. I read that phrase and I thought about the fabricated therapy receipts. The false service codes. The dates billed for sessions that Dr. Marion Chu's office had already closed. The LELC that had been registered 2 years before I aged out. The careful incremental withdrawals designed to stay below audit thresholds. Administrative imprecision. Angela called me after the statement dropped. She said, "This is actually good for us. The posture they are adopting publicly is going to conflict very directly with what the documentary evidence shows. Juries do not respond well to defendants who minimize in public and then cannot explain specifics in court." She was right. But there was something else in that statement that I kept coming back to. Something beyond the legal strategy of it. Douglas Whitfield still believed he could manage this, still believed that the right framing, the right language, the right presentation of himself as a good man, caught in an unfortunate complexity, could redirect the story. He had been doing it for 20 years, managing narratives, managing caseworkers, managing perceptions. He was very good at it. What he had not fully accounted for was that the person most familiar with the counter-narrative had spent 11 months reading every document in his file. And she had not moved on. She had not gotten tired. She had not decided it was too hard or too complicated or too emotionally costly to keep going. She had kept going. There is something I want to name directly here, because I think it gets lost in these kinds of stories. The hubris of people who have exploited systems for a long time is a very specific kind of hubris. It is not loud or obvious. It is quiet, patient. It looks like confidence and competence from the outside. It is the hubris of someone who has never been held accountable and has therefore concluded, at some deep level, that they are not the kind of person who gets held accountable. That conclusion becomes a blind spot. And blind spots, eventually, are exactly what brings people down. Douglas's blind spot was me. He had assessed me at 7 years old, a frightened, compliant, deeply grateful child with no advocate and no resources, and filed that assessment away permanently. He had never updated it. In his understanding of the situation, I was still that child, still manageable, still grateful enough or afraid enough, or just small enough that the right combination of words and framing could redirect me. I was 30 years old. I had a lawyer. I had 400 pages of annotated financial records. And I had 11 months of the specific, clarifying fury of someone who has finally understood exactly what was done to them and decided it is going to matter. He had never updated his file on me. That was his mistake. The trial began 14 months after the charges were filed. June. A courtroom in Montgomery County, Ohio. I drove to Dayton the night before and stayed in a hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse. A mid-range chain hotel with stiff pillows and a view of a parking structure. I ordered room service. Pasta. I watched television without really watching it. I called Deb. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Her kids, a garden she was trying to grow in her backyard in Cleveland, a documentary she had watched recently. She did not ask me how I was feeling about tomorrow. She knew what I needed, which was to talk about something ordinary until I was tired enough to sleep. That is what a real friend is. I testified on the 3rd day of the trial. Angela had prepared me again, more intensively this time. We had gone through every document I might be asked about, every date, every account number, every transfer. Gerald Foss's cross-examination lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. He tried 4 distinct approaches. The first was to suggest that my professional background in bookkeeping had led me to interpret neutral financial decisions as evidence of fraud, that I had arrived at a conclusion and built a framework around it. I walked him through the fabricated therapy receipt dates in response. He moved on. The second approach was to suggest that my emotional relationship with the Whitfields, my history as their foster child, my complex feelings about having lived in their home, made me a biased and unreliable narrator of the financial evidence. I acknowledged, calmly, that I had complex feelings about my time in the Whitfield home. I then noted that the financial records did not have feelings. The records were what they were. He moved on. The third approach was to suggest that certain transfers could be explained as legitimate administrative fees for the management of a minor's financial affairs, a standard practice that had simply not been properly documented. I asked, still calmly, whether he could point me to the documentation that supported that characterization, since I had reviewed the entire file and had not found it. He moved on. The fourth approach was the one I had been waiting for. He suggested, carefully, with the particular gentleness of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, that I had perhaps spent so many months immersed in this investigation that I had lost the ability to see the Whitfields clearly, that the people who had housed and fed and cared for a 7-year-old girl with nowhere else to go had perhaps been reduced, in my understanding, to something simpler and darker than they actually were. He suggested that grief, the grief of a child who had been let down by the system, who had wanted a family and not fully found one, might be shaping my account in ways I was not even aware of. He was trying to turn my history into my weakness. I let him finish, and then I said, I am aware of my history. I am aware of my feelings about the Whitfields. I am also aware that Douglas Whitfield registered Whitfield Property Holdings in 2007, 2 years before I aged out of his care, and that the LC received transfers from accounts held in my name on 7 separate occasions between 2008 and 2010. I am aware that Patricia Whitfield is listed as a member of that LLC. I am aware of the fabricated receipts, the redirected benefit accounts, and the Social Security fraud that continued for 11 months after my 18th birthday. My grief did not produce those documents. They existed before I ever saw them. Gerald Foss said, no further questions. I stepped down from the witness stand. My hands were completely steady. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. I drove back to Columbus after my testimony and waited. Sandra called me with updates when there were updates to give. Angela called me every evening. I went to work. I ate dinner. I did not sleep particularly well. On the afternoon of the third day, Angela called me at 2:47 in the afternoon. I was at my desk. Phil was across the room eating a sandwich. She said, guilty. Both of them. All counts. I put the phone down on my desk very gently. I looked at my computer screen for a moment. Then I got up and walked to the bathroom, which was the only private space available to me, and I sat down on the closed lid of one of the stalls and I put my face in my hands. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of this moment in a movie where the tears come, where the release is clean and visible and cathartic. That is not what happened. What happened was something more like a long exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, like something that had been held very rigid inside me for 11 months. For 30 years, maybe, just very slowly, very carefully let go. Douglas Whitfield was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. Patricia Whitfield received a sentence of 4 years, with eligibility for early release. Whitfield Property Holdings was dissolved as part of the legal proceedings. The civil judgment, which Angela pursued in parallel, resulted in a lien against their remaining assets. The number attached to the civil judgment was not $420,000. After legal fees, after the limits of what remained in their accounts, after years of expenditure that had already been spent and could not be recovered, the actual amount I received was significantly less. I am not going to tell you the exact figure, partly for legal reasons, partly because the number was, in some ways, beside the point by the time I received it. What I will tell you is that it was enough to pay off my student debt from community college, Enough to put a real down payment on an apartment I actually wanted to live in. Enough to feel, for the first time in my adult life, like I had a small piece of solid ground under my feet. It was not justice in the full mathematical sense. $420,000 of childhood cannot be refunded. But it was accountability. Real, documented, legally binding accountability. And that, the accountability, was what I had actually been fighting for. Marcus called me 3 weeks after the sentencing. I had thought about this moment. Whether it would happen, what I would say if it did. Marcus had been 9 years old when I arrived at Sycamore Lane. He had grown up in that house, eaten those pancakes, gone to that soccer clinic. He had not known what his father was doing. The investigation found no evidence of his involvement or awareness, and I believe that, genuinely. But he was still Douglas Whitfield's son. He still carried that name. He did not make excuses for his parents. That surprised me. He did not ask me to find a way to see them differently, or forgive them, or consider the complexity of what they might have been going through. He said, "I am so sorry, Lauren. What they did to you was wrong. I do not have words for how wrong it was, and I am sorry I was in that house and did not see it." I told him he was 9 years old. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He cried a little. I did not. We talked for about 20 minutes. We said goodbye. I do not know if we will talk again. I think about Marcus sometimes, about what it is to discover that your childhood was built on something you did not know was rotten underneath, about how the betrayal reaches forward and backward at the same time, touching every memory, every holiday, every Saturday morning pancake. He is living with a version of that retroactive contamination now. Not the same as mine, but real. I do not hate Marcus. I do not even hate Patricia. Fully. Though I have thought about her specific role in all of this more than I have thought about Douglas's. Because Douglas was the architect. But Patricia was the one who hugged me at that apartment door. Patricia was the one who made my favorite meal for my 18th birthday. Patricia was the one who called me, 11 months into the investigation, and talked for 4 minutes about how the daily care had been real, without once acknowledging the LLC, the redirected accounts, the fabricated receipts. She had compartmentalized so completely that I think, on some level, she had stopped being aware of the compartmentalization. I think she had told herself a version of the story where the warmth canceled out the theft, where the pancakes were a form of repayment, where the love, and maybe there was love, in some form, in some corner of it, was sufficient credit against everything else. That is a very human thing to do, and it is also one of the most dangerous things a human being can do. I am not going to tell you I have forgiven them. I am not going to perform a resolution that is not real. Forgiveness, if it comes, will be something I do for myself, on my own timeline, in my own way. And it will not mean that what they did not happen. It will not mean the accounts were not drained. It will not mean the receipts were not fabricated. It will not mean the 7-year-old girl who sat on the window seat and thanked them for being there was not, simultaneously, a financial asset being managed. All of that happened. All of it is documented. All of it is true. I want to take a moment before I close to tell you about the other two. Sandra's team located them both. A man named Terrence, who was living in Cincinnati, and a woman named Davina, who had moved to Louisville, Kentucky, after aging out. Both of them had, like me, spent years living ordinary lives with no knowledge of what had happened to their files. Terrence told investigators that when Sandra's team first contacted him, his first response was to assume it was a scam, that someone was trying to run a con on him using his old foster care history. He said it took him 3 separate conversations before he believed it was real. I understood that completely. When you have grown up inside systems that have failed you, the instinct is to be suspicious of anyone who shows up claiming to have found something that belongs to you. Because nothing has ever belonged to you. Everything has always been provisional. Davina cried when she found out. Sandra told me that. She cried on the phone for a long time, not because the number was so large. Her case had a smaller footprint than mine, but because of the specific grief of understanding that a family you had tried very hard to feel grateful toward had been counting you in a ledger the whole time. Both of them were included in the civil action. Both of them received their own judgments. I do not know the details of their settlements. I do not need to. What I know is that 3 people walked out of that house on Sycamore Lane with nothing but garbage bags and gratitude. And eventually, later than it should have been, harder than it should have had to be, someone came looking. That matters. The fact that someone came looking matters enormously, because the other version of this story, the version where the audit never gets triggered, where the unrelated case in another county never flags the pattern, where Sandra Pellegrino never picks up my file, that version exists too. In that version, I am still in Columbus eating dry cereal, and the Whitfields are still on Sycamore Lane, and $420,000 just quietly disappears into the life they built with it. That version almost happened. I do not know what to do with that, exactly, except to say it out loud. I am 31 years old as I finish telling this story. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus. I have a couch that I actually chose, and a plant on the windowsill that has survived 2 winters, which I consider a personal achievement. I still work in bookkeeping. I am good at it, and I like the precision of it, and I no longer find it ironic. I have Deb, who calls on Sundays. I have a few other people I trust in the specific, careful way that people who grew up without a safety net learn to trust, slowly, with attention, without assuming permanence. I have a therapist. Her office has a gray couch, not a beige one. And she does not put out mints. She is very good. I am working on things. Here is the question I get asked the most when I tell pieces of this story to people who know me. They ask, do you wish you had never found out? And I understand why they ask it. Because finding out costs something. The 11 months of documents and depositions and phone calls with Sandra and sessions with Angela, that was not free. The grief of the retroactive contamination, looking back at the window seat and the green notebook and the blueberry pancakes and attaching a question mark to all of it, that was not free. The specific, unresolvable sadness of knowing that the family I had needed so badly at 7 years old had been, on paper, doing math about me the whole time. That was not free. But here's the thing. Not knowing was also not free. I just was not being charged for it, in a way I could see. The 11 years between aging out and Sandra's call, those years cost something too. The off-brand cereal, the provisional survival, the way I had learned to make myself small when I needed something, because I had been trained from the age of 7 to be the kind of person who does not ask too many questions. The way I had filed the Whitfields under things that helped but are over now, instead of looking at them clearly, because looking at them clearly would have required me to look at myself clearly too. I had been carrying the weight of what was done to me for 30 years without knowing what it was. I just thought it was the weight of being me, the weight of where I came from. The baseline heaviness that I assumed everyone from a background like mine just walked around with. Finding out did not remove the weight, but it named it, and naming something, understanding its shape and its origin, and the specific hands that placed it on you, is different from just carrying it forever in the dark. I would rather know. I will always choose knowing. The last time I thought about Sycamore Lane, I was not thinking about Douglas or Patricia. I was not thinking about the documents, or the LLC, or the fabricated receipts, or the deposition, or Gerald Foss's 4 attempts to make me seem unreliable. I was thinking about Biscuit, the golden retriever who slept at the foot of my bed, who used to run in small, ecstatic circles whenever I came home from school, who did not know anything about accounts, or benefit programs, or what my history was worth on paper, who just knew that there was a kid in the house, and kids were worth running in circles for. That was real. I am sure of it. Whatever else was happening in that house, whatever calculations were being made and whatever documents, Biscuit's circles were real. I hold on to that, not as an excuse for anything, not as a way of softening what happened, just as a reminder that even inside the most deliberate betrayals, there are things that exist outside the transaction. Small, uncomplicated things that no one can retroactively contaminate. A dog running in circles. A kid who needed that. That is the part I am still learning how to carry. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. I mean that. This is not an easy story to sit with. And I think part of the reason stories like this need to be told is because there are a lot of people walking around carrying weight they do not have a name for yet. People who grew up inside systems that were supposed to protect them. People who trusted the wrong ones and are still figuring out what that means. If that is you, or if you know someone it might be, I want you to know that the weight having a name does not make it lighter immediately. But it is a start. I really want to know, would you have kept going the way I did? Or would you have handed everything to the state and tried to move on? There is no wrong answer. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them. And if this story reached something in you, if it felt like something worth passing on, you know what to do. Stories like this need to travel further than algorithm. They need people to carry them. I will see you in the next one.